Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the April 2021 General Members Meeting of the APS. We've got over 475 people signed up for the meeting, and certainly a stellar part of it is tonight's opening keynote address by Heather Cox Richardson. She'll talk for about 40 minutes. You can put your questions. We'll have traditional virtual Q&A. Put your questions in the Q&A function, and I will take it from there. Heather Cox Richardson is an American historian, professor of history at Boston College. Her specialty is 19th century America, politics, economics, issues of race, the westward expansion, and the construction of the concept of an American middle class. She specializes in politics and economics. In her most recent book, which I had the pleasure of reading a few weeks ago, How the South Won the Civil War, Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America, which explores the paradox at the heart of the American story between equality and being founded as a country in slavery. Many of you, perhaps like me, know her from her daily newsletter, Letters from an American. I start every morning with it. So it's a pleasure to welcome her. I'll just say what I forgot to say at the top. Anybody who wants to see what the rest of the meeting is about, please go to the APS website, amphilsoc.org. On the homepage, you'll see a link to everything to do with this meeting, the attendees, the book fair, everything else. But now it's my pleasure to turn the screen over to Heather Cox Richardson.
Hey, everybody, and thank you for being here. Well, Linda asked me to do this. I asked what you might like to hear. And one of the things that has sort of fallen out of my life is the ability to talk about real theory and academics. And so I thought you might be interested in the intellectual theory that is behind the work that I do at a popular level. So that being said, what I wanted to talk about today is entitled Mad Libs of Power, looking at the past to make sense of the present. And now I'm going to totally cheat because I don't actually watch Game of Thrones, but I want to show you a clip from Game of Thrones to set us off. It's only 1 minute and 52 seconds. And I hope I'm looking at you here to make sure you can see this. Is it showing up? If it's not, I wish somebody would tell me.
You'll be pleased to know our mutual friend is doing quite well in Lady Sansa's service.
Good. One of my better ideas.
It seems the Grand Maester has found his way into a black cell. Well played, my Lord Hand. But should I be worried? Janus, Slint, Pycelle, the small council grows smaller every day.
The council has a reputation for serving past hands poorly. I don't mean to follow Ned Stark to the grave.
Power is a curious thing, my lord. Are you fond of riddles?
Why? Am I about to hear one?
3 great men sit in a room. A king, a priest, and a rich man. Between them stands a common sellsword. Each great man bids the sellsword kill the other 2. Who lives, who dies?
Depends on the sellsword.
Does it? He has neither crown nor gold, nor favor with the gods.
He has a sword, the power of life and death.
But if it's swordsmen who rule, why do we pretend kings hold all the power? When Ned Stark lost his head, who was truly responsible? Joffrey, the executioner, or something else?
I've decided I don't like riddles.
Power resides where men believe it resides. It's a trick, a shadow on the wall. And a very small man can cast a very large shadow.
And now I'm going to go ahead and share with you my PowerPoint with that as a backdrop. All right, you should have in front of you now something that says Mad Libs of Power, looking at the past to make sense of the present. If that's not correct, I'd love it if somebody would jump in and tell me so. All right, so the reason I showed you that was because I am going to make an argument today that for what I hope is a new way to look at political power and power in society, arguing not intentionally based, as I say, on Game of Thrones, because I don't actually watch it. It's when I was talking to somebody about this, he said, you have to see this scene. Because what I'm going to argue is that in order to make sense of human history, what we really need to do is move beyond the categories that we look at nowadays, race, class, and gender, for example, and instead to examine the structure of power, not power structures, but the structure of power. And what I'm going to suggest today is that power relies not fundamentally on physical strength or of military might or on government, or on resources, or on gender, or race, or class, although all of those things can be harnessed to it. What I'm going to argue is that power resides in language, in the way we talk about things, because words, I'm going to suggest today, play on human psychology. And they can be used in the wrong hands in such a way that they play on human psychology to create systems of dominance and submission. And then once they have done so, to justify the hierarchies that then result in society. Okay, so in order to do this, let me start here, first of all, by defining power. And I'm going to define power around the concept of chickens. And that is that I'm going to take a look at the idea of power in a society as essentially a pecking order, as opposed to being sort of a struggle between different ideas. And if you look at power in society as a pecking order, power actually, and please give me a little room here to define it, is actually a system of dominance, a system of one person above an order. And most people generally just want to get along, but there are some people in a society who do in fact want to dominate. But power, as you accumulate it, brings perks. It brings the perks of money, for example, or of sex, or of rulemaking, or of culture, or whatever that particular society values. But at the same time, it stands above those things. Those are tools of power, because in a society, for example, that valued generosity, you could actually amass power by giving it away, by being generous, as opposed to accumulating stuff. So power is not actually about the trappings that our society gives it, but rather stands apart from those trappings. Or, for example, in a society that valued knowledge, you could get power through education, not by amassing things. Or in a society that values money, obviously you can harness money, but somebody who is seeking power can then go ahead in whatever terms of the society in which that person lives, using race, class, gender, sexuality, wealth, and so on, to go ahead and accumulate power, to use those things for their service. But how they will do so will depend on how their society works. So, for example, all women in a society might work together, or they might divide along issues of race or of class. And they will do so depending on what makes those particular women think will make them more powerful in the society in which they live. So what I'm going to be suggesting is that we have to move beyond issues of race, class, and gender, the way we look at them nowadays, and instead to look at issues of power, and that, in fact, power resides outside of the categories that we traditionally use, and that they depend on language. So how did I get here? I came to the idea of exploring the issue of power through language through my own work in political history. Because key to understanding the relationships of power and language is understanding the relationship between and leaders, between followers and leaders. And I'd written a number of books about sort of the zeitgeist of history and sort of said, this is the way people are thinking and this is how it translates into law. But I'd never actually pinned down the relationship between people at the top and people at the bottom. And this became a huge problem when I was writing my history of the Republican Party, because after all these books sort of about how ideas mattered and things mattered, I was writing a chapter in which the chapter could disappear from the book, but basically only about 6 people were in the chapter, including Grant and Roscoe Conkling here. And they, the entire action of what I was considering a huge issue in the late 19th century happened around a dinner table. It happened at a dinner party. And that actually made me sort of go back to the woodshed, if you will, and say, crap, either I've written 4 books that make no sense at all, and I've gotten it right now, or I'm somehow not, I somehow have not fully thought through the relationship between voters and leaders. So I started thinking deeply about what made a relationship between followers and leaders. Like literally, what makes that connection? How do they exchange ideas? And I spent a lot of time worrying about this. And finally, I turned to a Brazilianist who does a lot of political work as well. And what he suggested was that when he had been researching how one of his political figures made the transition from an era of dictatorship to an era of electoral politics, he wanted to bring the workers behind him to support him. And so he literally went to hate mail that he had gotten when he was a much more powerful figure and figured out what the workers wanted. And he literally circled the criticisms that these workers wrote and then adapted them into his speeches, and he signed them when he had adapted them. So my colleague Joel Wolfe could actually see the language coming from the workers and going directly into the work of a political leader. And what he discovered, of course, was that the leader was deliberately creating his own constituency by adopting its language. And so literally the language of the streets in that case had become the language of the leaders. But that gave me the ideas of how you could get language from the bottom up, if you will, but bottom up into the language of leadership. But it didn't answer a central question to me, which was how sometimes you got leaders speaking for the people who moved in very progressive directions, and how sometimes you got leaders speaking for the people who moved in anti-progressive directions, in reactionary directions, if you will. And the next step for me to figure that out came by turning to the work of Eric Hoffer. And Eric Hoffer ended up being a very important piece of the puzzle for how and why I think the way I do about language. Because what he did is he's a longshoreman writing in the 1950s, and I got into him through Eisenhower, because Eisenhower admired his work very much. And Eisenhower tried to tear down the idea of, or tear into the idea of why sometimes we get the rise of dictators. And what he said was that leaders play on very simple tropes to go ahead and create followings. So while you can get a leader like a dictator, like a political leader who rises from among the people by literally imitating the language of the people, you can also have things go the other way, where leaders will in fact create their own constituencies in a number of ways. So first of all, they find a population that is deeply unsettled, either because they have been economically dispossessed or religiously dispossessed, or feel like their culture has been left behind. And then they say to those people that, in fact, it's true that those people, those dispossessed people or those angry people, are in fact the heart of the country, and that they have been dispossessed from what they truly deserve because of somebody else, because of a group of outsiders. And who those outsiders are doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. You just need to give you just need to give people somebody to hate so that they begin to cohere amongst themselves. Gradually then, if you turn your supporters against somebody else, And if you tell them they are the true members of the polity, and they are the ones to whom the polity should belong, and you cheer them on as true patriots, and you urge them to hurt the other people, something important psychological takes place. That is, those supporters begin to dehumanize their opponents. And when they do that, they start to treat them badly. The patriots, if you will, start to treat those others badly. And as they treat those others badly, as they dehumanize them, psychologically, they need to continue to believe that those people are bad in order to justify their own behavior. So quickly, once you have begun to turn somebody against an other, you begin to have psychological power over them, because they have to continue to throw in their lot with the leader who tells them they're the good guys, because they don't want to wake up and say, oh crap, I was misled. Increasingly, then, they come to believe in that leader. And Hoffer called his subjects true believers, because they got to the point where they ceased to reason at all. They simply had to follow the leader, because by definition, believing flies in the face of reason. So the more that they have to follow that leader, because that leader is urging them to violence or to hurt other people, the more they become to believe in that person in really quite faith-based ways, if you will. And my comparison here is always Beatrix Lestrange, when you think about the Harry Potter books, who the more Beatrix Lestrange, the more Voldemort induces her to hurt other people, and the more she sees him hurt other people, the more she worships him. And she doesn't she's not just afraid of him the way Draco Malfoy's family is, for example. She actually loves him. And I think that this was quite a deliberate attempt to identify that kind of psychological power. So the more outrageous that person begets, the more those true believers adhere to the leader who has led them into a rhetorical stance, if you will, a rhetorical stance that is played on psychology. Well, as I was thinking about this, because I'm a fun person to hang around with, but it is interesting, isn't it? I of course, I'm a historian. I'm reading this other stuff for fun, and it hit me quite unexpectedly that what I was reading in things like True Believer sounded very much to me like some of the historical patterns that we have in America. So, for example, when I was reading this and thinking about this, I was also teaching the relationship between Congress and the Cherokees during the Cherokee removal of after 1830, after the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And what was really interesting is that there's a certain kind of language that jumps out at you, especially from people like Andrew Jackson, but from a number of congressmen who begin to talk about the Cherokees in a very othering language, in a language that removes them from society, very much as Hoffer suggested. So, for example, the Cherokees by the 1830s had in fact assimilated largely into Euro-American society. They'd embraced private land ownership, they grew cotton, they had even begun to own black slaves. Their chief, John Ross down here, is very well educated, far better educated, by the way, than President Jackson. He's well connected, and apparently he didn't even speak Cherokee very well. But in order to justify the taking of the Cherokees' lands, Andrew Jackson redefined Cherokees as, quote, savage hunters, unquote, who had less attachment to their land than settled Christians, as he said did. And the dehumanization of those Indians then made it very easy to go ahead and essentially steal from them and throw them off their land. Similarly, this jumped out to me as very similar to the language that enslavers used about Black slaves in the 1830s and the 1840s, and before that as well. Increasingly, beginning in the 1830s, after the land rush, after the Indian Removal Act, white enslavers began to talk about African-American slaves as dumb and unskilled, as people who were only suited for menial tasks. They were an inferior race. They were created to serve white people, and on, all those languages. So at the same time that I was looking at this, and you may or may not remember this. I'm afraid I don't. Here's a quote, by the way, from Alexander Stevens, who says something similar. There was a football player who got dragged out of, a football player who dragged his girlfriend out of an elevator by her hair. And I'm afraid I don't really follow football and I don't remember who they are, either of them, and somebody I'm sure will remember, maybe throw it in the chat. But the language that the people defending that football player used was virtually identical to the language that Andrew Jackson used to justify the taking of the Indian lands, or that that enslavers like William Henry Hammond used, James Henry Hammond, I'm sorry, used to justify the taking, the enslavement of African Americans. The language was very, very similar. So it seemed to be almost a picture-perfect version of Eric Hoffer in many ways, the idea of creating an other in some way and creating a way to say these people are somebody that you can abuse. And once you have done so, that creates a power structure that, that certain people are in and certain other people are out. So what was interesting about that then was that, and of course you see this, by the way, in images like this from The Color of Money by John Jones. This is a picture from South Carolina currency. And this is also, by the way, the same kind of language that you're going to get about industrial workers during the 1890s. The idea that they're just, that's what they're made for, essentially. But it did seem to me, the more I looked at this, that the language that these people were using was important to tear apart. And that actually took me into psychological studies. So I spent a lot of time studying the language of domestic abuse, how that language reinforces dominance or submission. So for example, domestic abuse almost always, according to psychologists, and by the way, I would just like to point out here, if I have scholars here interested in this, domestic abuse is so understudied in this country. It's just astonishing. There's good psychological literature on it, but there is so little historical literature. Unfortunately, it's not going to be me who does it, but somebody ought to. But what was interesting, if you study the psychology, is that it almost, well, not almost, it always rests on a narrative that one partner is more worthy than the other. And the dominant partner rewrites history in his or her own favor. So for example, the identifying themes of domestic abuse cases are identical. The dominant partner suggests that he or she, or they, I'm just going to use they, are helping the weaker partner because they are smarter, they are kinder, they are more able. So I'm giving you the language of domestic abuse, but you can read Jackson on that. You can certainly read enslavers on that as well. Either nature or society or sometimes God has dictated this inequality, and in order to help, as it were, the subordinate partner, the dominant partner makes suggestions and makes corrections and corrects that person to enable that person to behave better. But of course, the goalposts constantly change, and the subordinate partner can never quite be good enough to go ahead and be equal to the dominant partner. As the subordinate partner does more and more and more to try and get back to being an equal to the dominant partner increasingly has to amp up the disappointment, amp up the destruction of the subordinate partner, move the goalposts further and further, and ultimately to resort to violence. And the more the dominant partner resorts to violence, the more the dominant partner, of course, goes ahead and retreats to sorrow and I'm only trying to do what's right for you. And here I gave you the language here: superiority, benevolence. This is a burden. I'm teaching you. I'm reprimanding you for your own good, correcting you for your own good. And I am so misunderstood. I am the victim here. On the other hand, the subordinate person is inferior, is dumb, is untalented, is dishonest, is ungrateful for all that person is killing me here, because you know where I'm going, right? All this person is doing for them. And one of the key ways that, that this relationship is reinforced is through random reinforcement. First of all, you never know what's going to happen. You're always nervous. You're always wondering what that dominant partner is going to do. And through gaslighting, a word that has come very much into our political lexicon. So this explains why a subordinate partner doesn't lead. So the statistics show that it takes an average of 7 attempts for a subordinate partner to leave an abusive relationship. They're afraid, of course, for their lives, because the more it looks as if the subordinate person is going to leave the relationship, the more dangerous the dominant person becomes. But most abusers, in fact, never have to hit a subordinate in order to make that person stay, because they play on the idea that they're benevolent. And if only that subordinate partner will try just a little bit harder, that's the time it's going to work. And they offer quite random rewards for that good behavior, and they continually engage in gaslighting. Gaslighting constantly changes the victim's perceptions of reality in order to keep them off balance all the time. And a great example of this is Richard Pryor's brilliant skit about, the wife walks into a bedroom and her husband's in bed with another woman. And while the wife just melts down, the man and the woman in bed with him get out of bed, they get dressed, they make the bed, they clean everything up. The other woman walks out, and the Richard Pryor character goes, "What are you upset about? Nothing happened here." And she starts to say what happened. She goes, "Who are you going to believe?" And he goes, "Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes?" All right. Again, they increasingly insist that they are not, that they're the true victims, and that the subordinates should be thanking them for their willingness to go ahead and continue to guide them. When reality challenges their version of reality, they insist that the subordinate is wrong, is misinformed, and is making false accusations that actually mean that the dominant figure is being wronged, until almost always the subordinate figure apologizes. Indeed, that is a key way to reinforce dominance. And among other things, by the way, that doctors will tell you that has a chemical component in it as well, because it actually affects the brain's intermittent reinforcement actually affects the brain somewhat like gambling. You do actually get a hit of I think it's dopamine that makes a subordinate feel better when they get that hit. And gaslighting, which is more interesting to me at this moment in history, is important because it so reduces victims' sense of reality that they become unable to do anything. They become unable even to go grocery shopping, because they never know what's real any longer, because the world is changing all the time, and they lose their ability both to remember things but also to know what is real. All right. So why do we care about any of this? You can certainly look at how this affected Jackson. And you can certainly go on, and I'm happy to spin this out if you'd like, but I suspect you'd like me to get on to where I'm expecting this to go. You can play it out through Jackson. You can play it out through any number of Supreme Court decisions about Indigenous people. And certainly you can play it out in relationships between dominant men and women in American history. And you can certainly play it out when you look at the institution of paternalism in slavery, the concept that slaves simply don't understand what's good for them, and plantation owners are civilizing the enslaved. Their life is better in America than in Africa, the story goes, and the dominant enslavers are making sacrifices for them, engaging, if you will, in the white man's burden. Increasingly, there is this sense in these relationships between Indigenous people, Black people, and so on, and the dominant culture, that they are again subordinates that the dominant culture is taking care of. And the more that happens, the more that reinforces the power structure within the language that the power structure is supporting the power structure. Okay. But so obviously, I'm not sort of leading you down this path only for the historical interest in it, but rather because as I read to you those terms and as I have described this, I hope you can see that one of the things that has been so extremely fascinating about Republican politics in the last at least 16 years has been the use of this language, has been the setup of a dominant structure and a subordinate structure through rhetoric in our political system. So, for example, in 2012, when Mitt Romney was taped at a private meeting, Mitt Romney was the Republican nominee for president in 2012, when he was taped talking about makers and takers, how it's the makers in society, the people, the 53% of people who know how to run society, who are supporting the takers, who are the subordinates who are lazy and don't want to work and need to be directed, need to be told what to do. When Peter Thiel goes ahead and talks about how democracy and is incompatible with liberty, he's talking about the idea that you need to keep people at you need to keep subordinates dependent on the people in charge. And crucially, I'm going to show you something here. I guess I'll wait to do that. You see it with the constant during the last administration, and frequently on the Fox News channel when the personalities on that show, or in the case of former President Trump, when he interacted with journalists or other people, he would insist on them correcting things that were factually correct. And you saw that most astonishingly and fully when at the very first day, and that was important, of his term in office, the former President Trump exaggerated the size of his crowds, the crowds that he said had showed up for his inauguration. And there was, of course, enormous photographic evidence of that. I mean, it was quite clear that that was a lie. It was a lie, but it was a very important lie. I mean, people sort of laughed about it at the time or kept saying, what are you talking about? And they made memes about it. But when you force your subordinates to accept an untruth, to accept something that did not happen, when you gaslight them, it is a key way to reassert dominance or to assert dominance over them. And you saw this all the time with the Trump administration, where he would lie about things that there was absolutely no reason to lie about. But what was key to understanding about that is that it wasn't about the lie. It wasn't about whether or not that hurricane was really going to hit Alabama or whatever it was. It was about, can I make you accept this? And you don't necessarily have to believe it, but you need to accept it. Because once you have gone down that path, once you have started to accept the things that your leader says, you're in. In order to turn and say, wait a minute, no, I don't believe this anymore, you have to be willing to do what Eric Hoffer said was so hard to do. You have to be willing to say, no, I made a really big mistake, and all of the things that I did based in this belief are wrong. And once you have started that process in motion, it's very, very difficult to stop. So increasingly, if you think about it, during the previous administration, during the previous administration, the Republican Party talked about how it was always victimized. It was always trying so hard to do what was right, and it was always being victimized by the group that came to be all of the Democrats. They during the course of the Trump administration, they expanded the size of the enemies list to include virtually all Democrats. But they're victimized. They're trying to do what's right. They are really the people who should have been in control of everything all along, and they're being challenged by these subordinates. You can do this language out yourself. And here's the key part of this for the political side of it is, once you have established that big lie, or once you've established that lie, the lies get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And so right now, in American society, we are literally at risk of losing our democracy because of what has been called the big lie. And that is the big lie that Trump, in fact, won the 2020 election. He didn't. He lost the 2020 election by more than 7 million votes, and he lost handily in the Electoral College, interestingly enough, by the same amount he won over Hillary Clinton by 232 to 306. But that idea that he has been cheated, been victimized, that he, in fact, is the victim, and that our society has been taken over by the subordinates is absolutely the outcome of the language from the day when he said that his inaugural crowds were so big. Once you start getting people to believe lies, the lies get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until you end up someplace that you can't imagine that you ever would be. So now I want to show you something. And this is actually, I took a conversation between, at the time, candidate Trump and Corey Lewandowski, at the time was running his campaign. And I took out the words here and suggested to you, you could add some in. Now tell my friends, how loyal was blank to you, whoever you are? And the one would be a politician, a slaveholder, a husband, or a boss to an underling, a slave, a wife, or employee. So how loyal was your boss to you, the employee? More than I could possibly fathom. And I was so grateful to your loyalty, replies the employee. Oh, it was great, says the boss. I'm proud of you, employee. You took it. It wasn't easy. The boss wasn't as effective for the last couple of months. Right, boss? The employee says, or I'm sorry, the employee you weren't as effective as you should have been for the last couple of months, right? And then the guy asks the employee to go ahead and agree with it. Yes, sir, he replies. And then he literally went on and said, you're a good person. And that was a horrible thing that the boss did to him. And goes on here, I'm sorry, now I'm all tangled up in my ones and twos, but you can see that this language, he was literally employing this very language as early as the beginning of 2016, before we got into where we ended up now. So that idea that language is the language of power is one of the things that has informed the work I do when I deal with news at night. But I want to bring it back full circle here to an academic argument. And that is that I am certainly not the first person in the world to identify the importance of language. And you know, I'm a huge fan. I'm not a Marxist, but I'm fond of Gramsci for understanding the power of language to go ahead and construct power relationships. But I am more interested in how language can actually create power structures within a society. And so what I would argue is, if instead of looking at the current categories we look at, race, for example, or gender or class, and get rid of them, and I don't mean get rid of them altogether, I mean get rid of them as our primary categories, and instead replace those categories with the idea of power and how those things can be used to garner power through language, I think we're going to end up with a very different kind of history of the way we look at things. So, for example, it's I mean, you could call it intersectionality, but it's really something slightly different, in that it looks at society as a whole, not at one group against another, but rather how different groups have gone ahead and fallen into that pecking order, so that sometimes a Korean grocer is high and sometimes a Korean grocer is low, depending on what the dominant language of the time is and how that language is putting him or her on that power pecking order. It is, I am hoping, a way to reconceptualize relationships entirely between dominant groups and subaltern groups. But if this is the case, and if in fact focusing on language can move us beyond binaries, for example, of race or class or gender, or black, white, and all that, it suggests that we are perhaps able to move into a more complicated web. And possibly that web is one of the things that's creating such excitement today, and also such fear on the part of certain people, because it does suggest that they don't have those binaries anymore. They don't know who to hate, and they're getting to be too many people to hate, and they don't know where their place in the pecking order is. I would also like to suggest that if in fact we went this route and used this idea of language and power to go ahead and rethink the way we think about structures in history, it might offer us two new things. It might offer us, first of all, a new way to integrate concepts of gender into political history, because it is, of course, very difficult to look at structures of institutional power before the very recent past, in America anyway, it's the only thing I can talk about, without, and look at women, because women aren't sitting in Congress. I mean, they're certainly sitting in a lot more places than people thought they were. But if in fact this language of power structures is embedded in our political system, in fact, language itself brings gender into every discussion, and race and class into every discussion. It also might be a way to go ahead and revisit the concept of psychological history. So there's a whole period in the 1970s and 80s where people tried to do psychobiographies, for example, and those were looking at individual psychology. And I would like to suggest instead, and as I do try and do in the letters that I write, that perhaps we can look at society, psychology and society as a whole, and that might change the way we think of history, because we will be looking at psychology as garnered through language, not sort of mass psychosis, but rather how does language develop certain psychological relationships, which changes the way we could do psychobiology. And it also might give us a new way to think about colonialism, because if in fact that I am right, and that language establishes power structures, then it would in fact suggest that if you live within a power structure, much like Ramsey suggested about the different class structures, if you live within that power structure, the simple act of removing a certain group of people from a colonial dominance, for example, doesn't change the language. It doesn't actually change the pecking order. It only changes who's in the pecking order and the order in which they're in that pecking order. So it might be a way to think more fully about colonialism and how the patterns laid down by language end up continuing to define the way societies work, even as the leaders of the societies change. It also, of course, would suggest a different way to look at the rise of dominant autocrats, for example, or oligarchs in the modern era. And it certainly might give us a way nowadays to think about what's happened in our country lately, which is just astonishing to me. The challenge in the last, really, as I say, 12 years or so, that has taken us largely from a democracy into something that increasingly looks like it might devolve into, if not an either an oligarchy or an autocracy. And again, there too, you see the power of language and garnering support through language. So at the end of the day, I'm making a historical argument that I hope changes the lens through which we see the past, suggesting that race, class, and gender, for example, are all categories, but they are categories that serve a much larger story, which is the story of power. And while it I hope changes the way we see the past, I think it also says an awful lot about where we are in today's history at this moment. All right, thank you. I hope that made some sense, and I will happily take questions about it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Okay. Heather, thank you very much. We have some questions in the chat. I invite more, but I'll take maybe here, come back here. I'll take my usual prerogative and throw out the first question. I wonder if you can turn the lens on religion and talk a bit about the sense of victimization that the Christian majority in the United States today, especially the evangelical community, which is the largest community of Christians, if I'm right, in the country today, where that sense of victimization comes from and how some of our recent political leaders have managed to exploit it. And tell me if you think I'm right, that this is a factor that has been crucially important in our recent politics, but that since talking about religion seems to be one of the last taboos we have in society, we can talk about everything else but religion. I don't think it's gotten quite enough attention, but tell me if you think that's right.
I think it is right, but I'm going to be horrible here and throw back at you the fact that I think you have a lot to say about that, thanks to your phenomenal article about abortion from a few years ago, and how when you talked about that is a truly great article, which argues that the backlash. You're looking confused. I hope it's you.
No. I'm yeah.
Well, just the recognition that when the one of the things that weaponized evangelicals in America was after Kent State in May of 1970, when Nixon and Buchanan recognized that they needed to go ahead and find a new constituency, and they turned to Democratic Catholics and tried to bring them on board. So I'm talking about your article about the backlash against Roe v. Wade, which wasn't a backlash; it was a front lash, with the idea that that the Republican Party began to weaponize religion at that point. And I think that was really very deliberate. If you look at the formation of the moral majority, and then George W. Bush's outreaches to the evangelicals, bringing them into the fold. The only way you can keep those people on board is to go ahead and feed their sense of victimization. And that's one of the things that was interesting after the appointment of Gorsuch, and of course one of the reasons that Mitch McConnell decided to keep that seat open was because you had to make them feel that they were desperate to get that Supreme Court seat so that they could finally stop being victims. But by definition, they can't stop being victims. They always have to be victimized, or they will cease to bother to vote. So I think it's been quite a deliberate thing on the part of the current Republican majority, to keep them engaged.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question from our member Larry Tribe. How self-consciously do you suppose characters like Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump deployed this dynamic of gaslighting to the point of dominance? How self-consciously did they do it?
That's a great question, and I don't think it was self-conscious. I think it, at least in the case of Jackson, and I'm fascinated by Trump because I think that he is a salesman, and he recognizes, he's a very good salesman, and he recognizes these relationships without necessarily being able to articulate them, but he knows them instinctively. So he will never apologize. Another major red flag. He will never apologize, and he always has to be right. He always has to be dominant with, as I say, things like that stupid Sharpie. Who cared? But he can't back down. And I think he does that in part because of his own psychological damage. And I'm not going to make a biography of Andrew Jackson because I don't know him personally well enough. But I do think that there are personalities that gravitate toward that kind of language. But again, interestingly enough, and I think I didn't perhaps explain this well enough, one of the things that fascinates me about this is sometimes those personalities become benevolent. So look at somebody like LBJ, who is, in a modern era, and I got in real trouble when I said this in public before, but I'm going to try it again. In the modern era, he might well be a Ted Cruz. But the language that was around him, the things that made him recognize that he could garner power, and again, I'm speaking really theoretically here because I'm certainly not going to take a stand on LBJ's personal life. But the things that made him go ahead and be benevolent in the 1960s, that the language and the drive of society in the 1960s might do the exact opposite today. I'm suggesting that people like Jackson and Trump and LBJ, if you will, are responsive to their language around them more than they are necessarily driving it.
Here's a question from Brenna Holland, who's a member of the APS staff. She says, I especially thought your points on the language of domestic abuse was convincing. It made me think more about the applicability of the dynamics of intimate relationships on a large scale. I wonder if you could talk more about how contemporary social media has enabled what you see happening now under this model that you've explained.
So I would like to start by saying I'm not a psychologist, and this is the only, I'm a political historian, and I'm fascinated by this dynamic because I'm fascinated by the relationship between people on the ground and their leaders. So, and I suspect you could take this into many other realms, other political realms, if you will, and to look at society around other different psychological dimensions, but I will not be the one doing that. That being said, one of the things that is very interesting about social media, I think, is Twitter and Facebook, but especially on Twitter, the fact that there is such abuse of women, and the tendency of certain male personalities to try and silence women. And I see much less victimization, although certainly you see the certain people on Twitter sort of complaining that they're always being picked on. But I will tell you, as a woman very active in those fields, there is at least one day a week when I say, I just can't do it anymore. I just cannot wake up to this much hate mail and this much horrible stuff, and my male colleagues don't get it. And the thing that keeps me coming back is the fact that I know that that's what they want. They want to shut me up, so it doesn't work. But I do think that it has opened the door for that sort of naked, if you will, power dynamic to play out without gatekeepers. And I suspect that is not going to survive all that long, because the platforms simply are going to become uninhabitable for anybody except the dominant players. Interestingly enough, there was a study the other day that about gamers. Did you see that study about the way that gamers interact? And it suggested, and this is only one study, but it suggested that when a female gamer enters a chat, alpha males, and somebody studied this, alpha males welcome that person, but beta males turn on that person with all the things that I've just talked about, because they're afraid that their own dominance is going to be challenged by the females who might get above them closer to the alpha males. And I thought that was a really provocative study, and one that I suspect could lead us in some really interesting directions.
Yeah, I bet that dynamic is transferable to many other contexts. Here's a question from our member, Judith Shapiro. Is the argument here that the strategy for justifying power and an important way of sustaining it are the same as the means of creating and developing it?
I'm not entirely sure I'm getting what you're asking. I think I'm getting it here. Let me answer what I think you're suggesting, and that is, am I concerned about the structures of power because I would like to change them? Absolutely. And do I write in such a way that I hope to be combating these ideas and organizing them for a different purpose? Absolutely. I think that what I'm suggesting is a historical argument and also a political argument, but it is also an argument for political action.
Okay. Our executive officer, Bob Hauser, asked, to be sure, race, class, and gender are currently overvalued as structures that reinforce power relationships. That, to today's sociology, is what explanations of Hitler's rise to power were the central issue in a previous generation. And parenthetically, and that one was perhaps more consistent with your account of the import of words. Having acknowledged that as a persuasive part of your argument, my question is the extent to which words and language have been central to the creation of political hierarchies throughout history.
Well, I am positing this as an argument that I have come to believe, that the way that political hierarchies work is through dominance and through the language of dominance. And as proof, I would offer, as I say, the examples that I brought forward from American history, especially that between Congress people and Indigenous Americans, but it's everywhere. It is everywhere. But I would also suggest that it is really, really worth, and I obviously, when I started getting into this, this was long before I was actually watching. I wasn't watching Trump. I He wasn't on my horizon at all. I was watching Ted Cruz, and really just astonished by a scene in which he, after one of the government shutdowns that he had been instrumental in, he was doing an interview with a journalist, and the journalist said, "Well, when you shut down the government," he said, "I didn't do that." And the journalist said, "What are you talking about? Of course you did. You did this." And he said, "I didn't do that." And the guy said, "But we were there." He said, "No, it didn't happen." And I just was gobsmacked at the idea that he could do that. But I think what that does is, and what we have seen over the last administration, is the ability of people to create realities through words. And that's something that I think we really have to look closely at, not least because if you look at where we have come from in the last 4 years, or even in the days since January 7th of 2021, it's really astonishing that we are where we are. And I don't see a real explanation for that, except the power of words to create a dangerous voting bloc, if you will, that has forced even people who might otherwise not come along to support a certain position.
Well, this leads to what I think has to be our final question from David Hollinger. What role does education play in equipping people to resist being hornswoggled in the way that you've described?
Well, it's interesting you would say that, because I got into it the other day with a journalist who had said that, had suggested that we should not have, that everybody shouldn't vote, that this was not acceptable. And I'm misstating his argument, but I think you probably, if you've been reading the papers, you know who that was and what the argument was more fairly than I just presented it. And I suggested that the real answer to his question about the dangers of democracy and democracy in the hands of a mob was education. And that, it seems to me, is the central piece of democracy, is that you really can't have a democracy unless you have a highly educated people. And of course, that's exactly where Abraham Lincoln started when he had to counter arguments in the 1850s that everybody, that even the limited suffrage they had at the time should not, was too broad. And he argued heavily for the idea of universal education. And that is something that has been incredibly important to American democracy all along, until very recently. So I would say that actually education is enormously important, both to help people enable people to recognize when they are being pushed into a dominant relationship or being selected to be part of a superior relationship. It's also incredibly important because it will enable people to recognize how to function in democracy. So I actually think it's pretty important.
Okay, well, we have more questions, but we're out of time. And just want to thank you very much for sharing part of your evening with us for kickoff of the April meeting. I hope you stick around. You have the links yourself for the next couple of days. And I hope everybody comes back at 1 o'clock Eastern tomorrow afternoon, when we will start our first full day or full afternoon with a special treat that night of the April meeting. So Heather Richardson, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank everybody for joining us, and good night.